Welcome to the Tavora Talks, InfoSec podcast, and daily news, brought to you by Tavora. Hey, my name is Cash, and welcome to another episode of Tavora Talks, InfoSec podcast. As always, I'm here with my partner in cybercrime, Matt Mosley. What's up, Matt?
Hola.
We are the members of the incident response team here at Tavora. We're going to be talking about the latest news in cybersecurity, giving you updates on the newest threats, vulnerabilities, and software tools to help keep you up to date on the war against cybercrime. Today, we're going to be discussing all things cloud security. What does it mean? How do we do it? What are the risks? And to help shed some light, we are joined by the cloud guru himself, Chris Callas. He is the head of our cloud security team here at Tavora. Chris, welcome to the show, and thanks for being our very first guest.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Well, good to have you. So before we dive into it, Chris, if you want, maybe shed some light on you, give a little bit about yourself so the world can learn a little bit more about who is Chris.
Oh, geez. I think the title says it all, head of cloud security over here at Tavora. Been with Tavora about 5 years, currently based over on the East Coast since we're a nationwide practice now. And, security's been, I think I met Matt before I even worked at Tavora. Is that right, Matt? Or before you came back to Tavora? This just always being,
That is correct.
Yes. Yeah, doing something with security. So that's me. But the cloud is a huge thing, right? So cloud is, you don't get a lot of opportunities throughout people's careers to actually go through and be able to re-architect stuff, right? And cloud's presented that opportunity. It allows organizations to ask, hey, why do we do things a certain way? But it also, raises the huge security flag. And even though there are a lot of great things the cloud has done from a security perspective, there's still a lot of work to do, and that's how we're here to help.
Well, yeah. So, let's kind of dive into it. There are always cloud security risks, right? And it's nonstop. Like recently into news today, Docker, they've been attacked again. I don't know what about again, but they've been attacked. Their servers are being used for crypto mining. And another big company, email.it, they've been breached. 600,000 records are being sold on the dark web as we speak, which brings up the subject, like you were talking about, like how secure is the cloud really? Like, what do you guys think about these two attacks? Is there anything they could have done to prevent it? Did they go about it the right way, wrong way? But overall, what do you guys think?
How does the cloud work? Nobody knows how the cloud works.
Yeah. What is the cloud?
Yeah, the proliferation of asses, you know what I mean? Things done as a service, infrastructure as a service, everybody's workloads, the applications that run, essentially for their applications. But everybody's workloads, they could either be managing the systems. You could have somebody like AWS manage the systems. You could have a third party, manage a certain service or environment, something like, like your databases or maybe like your storage or your backup solutions, that type of stuff. And, I think the first thing when it comes to the cloud and security is just roles and responsibilities. Amazon preaches about this a lot. They call it of the cloud and in the cloud, and they make it clear that they're responsible for the infrastructure, but you're responsible for your underlying systems, right? And within AWS, there's on the console, there's an artifact link. And even though it has a lot of compliance standards, there's Excel sheets that are attached to those compliance standards, and they tell you what security looks like. If you have to have a stateful firewall, or if you need to have some type of network intrusion detection, and really getting that baseline for what you're responsible for, I think is key for your first step in the cloud. What about you, Matt?
Sure. I have no idea how the cloud works. I just go to you and say, hey, can you make it work? Go
to a website, press start, everything works, right?
Exactly. But with that said, we were talking a little bit earlier on Docker. And again, I don't know what Docker is. I kind of have a general idea, but you were saying something about in order for this type of attack that we're talking about earlier, you basically have to go out of your way to allow this to happen. Is that correct?
Yeah, by default, you actually do have to go out of your way to allow this to happen, because the Docker daemon itself, it's their API control plane. It isn't bound to a network socket. When you stand it up in its default config, you actually have to bind it and expose it, right? And then we start talking about best practices in terms of management, internal and not having things publicly facing, that type of stuff. But you do actually have to go out of your way to make this public. And I think, when it comes to containers, we were talking about this a little bit. Containers are great. Do you remember when you would have like a shrewded application like years ago?
You're like a virtual or even a
Yeah.
removable hot swappable hard drive.
Yeah. Like you'd log in and something that's web, right? Or you would log in and it says your roots, but you try to get stuff and it's like, oh, this is obviously it's just Apache, right? You're in a shrouded environment that's segmented. And that's what
Got it.
Docker really reminds me of. Docker is pretty neat because you're just providing the resources that are, I think the first mindset when we're talking about Docker is you need to really be providing, it just provides the resources necessary to run that in Nginx or that Redis server, right? So, you don't have to rely on system dependencies and upgrading operating systems within your environment. Everything is self-contained and everything's immutable. And what's great about things being immutable is if a vulnerable version of an application gets discovered, you treat it like software, right? You're merging the latest version to master. Meanwhile, your data stores, that's what stays generally persistent. If it has to be, something like with like a Redis server, or if you have like config files or something that you want to use. Actually, even with config, you should be configuring it via a Docker file. The Docker file is what kind of tells you the state of that machine. If you look at Docker, it's a lot like GitHub. The Docker website, it's a lot like GitHub, and it tells you, hey, pull this image if you want to use this image, or push it to your guys' repository or something like that. So everything is done as code, which is great.
So if a container gets compromised, you can just burn it or tear it down and then put up another container. Is that correct?
Well, okay. So I forgot what Docker calls it. So you shouldn't be able to just turn it off, right? Generally, these things run as, and I'm blanking on the name, but essentially, if you like change the code or something like that, it's always on. It's self-correcting. It'll fix itself, start itself back up, right?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really neat. But when you log in, that's a good point, because when we're out, reviewing configurations, you would think, hey, I'm dropping into the show. So one, these Docker containers, they don't even have accounts, right? You have to leverage, it's like Docker image exec, and you have to specify a certain container to actually drop into a shell on it. So it's done through that daemon itself, right? That's the control plane allows you to run the commands like you're actually a shell user. So that's really the beauty of it. But the biggest thing that we see that people do is they'll have configuration files within that root, within that root account that's running within that container. And that configuration file, may have like your secrets that exist, have information on how you get to the database. And that was something that was interesting about this. I think it was this malware, or it was one of the articles that Thread Post linked. But when you follow it down a little bit, it'll just look at your SSH folder to figure out what systems it should be trying to connect to, and that type of stuff.
Oh yeah, to propagate to.
Yeah, and since there's no shell, you run into a weird situation with auditing, right? Because you have to be very specific with your verbiage, because there may be an orchestration layer on top of it that does all the management, right? And hey, getting access to the master node is different than if you want to drop into a shell like on the actual system. That's an entirely separate set of things that need to be hardened, and we can get to that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But,
so is this malware attacking those config files that you're talking about?
So, when you take a look at the initial command that's used, you could see they use bin bash c apt-get update, apt-get install wget, service cron start. So it looks like it does a cron job. I haven't looked at the shell script that's in there. I'd be curious to see what it does from the Docker point of view. But this just looks like somebody's, just installing some, prerequisites for this, which means if somebody can see something's publicly exposed and drop into a system, that means they're dropping into the systems with some type of privilege. So it's almost like, hey, we could say it's Docker, but I think saying it's just Docker adds to a layer of confusion. And this is something we were talking about, where it's, hey, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of core technology and how it works, right? And that initial command that's used in every single attack, not having things publicly exposed, not having things over privileged on a Linux system, this is just core, system hardening right here, before you even get to, running all the fun Docker stuff.
So like for these guys, like what I was reading, okay, so it was getting attacked and they're using it for Bitcoin. What does that do for Docker and the people using the Docker service? Like what kind of load is that putting on the servers? Is it going to drop people off, or connectivity issues? How does that affect everything?
Well, I don't think it's going to cause any type of, it depends like the orchestration layer that's involved, but the orchestration layer, the second resources get, start getting tied up, it starts spooling out multiple containers. There's a really cool, if you do like the welcome to Docker tutorial on the website, I think one of the examples is a Redis server. You keep on hitting refresh, you keep on loading the page in a different browser, then you start seeing it spawn multiple containers, which is really neat. So until you hit that limit, but the issue is with the cloud, one of the things that's different is you don't have to call up a system admin, or whoever your server guy is in the data center to install a new system because you're all of a sudden out of resources. You have pretty much, limitless power on tap via API with AWS, right? So you need to be really cognizant. And it's funny because if you look at the well-architected framework, I remember the first time I was going through it, one of the pillars is cost optimization. And I was like, well, what does this have to do with security, right? Because the whole concept of security is at its core. And the whole point of the cost optimization is identifying if resources have been compromised. So with Docker, since there's mass adoption with it, there's great tools out there like a Datadogs. From what I'm told, we're not sponsored by Datadogs or anything, but Datadogs hit me
Not
up.
yet.
Not yet.
They haven't got a hold of this cool ass podcast.
Right.
Send us some t-shirts.
Yeah, but the way that people visualize this availability, they're usually well ahead of it. In terms of system dependencies, they're monitoring the dependencies to the systems to make sure there's not going to be any outages. So I'm sure people that just do a little bit of monitoring, some of the a lot of those like bigger organizations, even medium-sized ones, Datadogs, you could get for free. You could get visibility instantly on there, and you should have a baseline pretty, after running your application a little bit, understand what the baseline is and start identifying, especially something like ransomware. Right.
Yeah.
But imagine if those things.
I'm still getting a bill for $50 from AWS. I have no idea why. I've turned everything off. I've deleted everything. I don't know how the cloud works.
Yeah, I got my bill down to 20 so far. It was 100 for a little bit, and I was like, "What's going on with this?" I'm like, "What did Matt do last time he was in?"
Yeah, I have no idea, man.
That's why I set you guys up in Control Tower. I was like, "I'm just going to give these guys their own VPC, like their own, account now," and I just delete it every single time you guys are done with it. I'm like, "Okay, that'll eliminate that issue."
But that is a good tip that I haven't ever thought of. Actually, was that monitoring your billing, right? That would be a good indication that you're something is odd in your environment, right? If all of a sudden you're using a lot of data or a lot of CPU usage, those would be pretty good indicators of compromise, right?
So I have an interesting story about this. So one of our first AWS accounts, and we got AWS, actually, let's not include this part because
we're going to be disclosing some secrets here.
You guys are getting me a little too comfortable here.
A guy I know had an AWS account that got compromised.
Yeah. Okay. So starting from
let me tell you about this client I know that.
I was like, how do I talk about people in this point of view? I'm just like, do I say a client, a medium, large, just a client? I think is okay because that's how we get the experience, right? And that's what's coming from this podcast itself. We're just not, giving any.
Oh, we're keeping all this in, by the way. Don't think we're cutting this out.
Oh Jesus. Oh jeez. Well, I'm trying to find the name for it because
this is real talk. InfoSec podcast.
Oh yeah. So Docker calls it live code reload. And it's probably one of my favorite features because what happens is as, say there's a new version of Pi-hole, a DNS ad sync that exists. They had a remote code execution that came out like a little bit ago, right?
By the way, Pi-hole is amazing. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it.
It's my favorite thing because it allows people to get technical that aren't maybe super technical, but it's like, hey, it's a fun little exercise to get it deployed. And it feels like, it made such a big impact at home. You know what I mean? Pi-hole's a pretty great app, but they did have remote code execution. And this was after I migrated my whole home infrastructure over to Docker. So I run my Unify controller, I run Pi-hole and a bunch
Wait a minute. You can run Docker at home? I thought this was a cloud thing.
Well, so that's the beautiful part about the cloud. So if we're talking about configuration management, right, tools, and that's something that's essential, bringing it back to hardening these systems that Docker lives on. These configuration management tools, they usually have different backends. So you don't become beholden to a single, hey, I'm at home, hey, I'm in AWS, hey, I'm in Azure. You usually just swap out a backend and then point it there, and it's able to spin things up, which is pretty neat.
Weird. I'm going to have to look this stuff up because I'm lost right now.
But yeah,
Docker, I know some of this stuff, but how do I run Docker at home to configure my home, smart home?
Be careful when you're doing that because you could run Docker desktop, which allows you to get hands-on experience without spinning up a server, but also remember all those rise in RDP attacks because everybody's working from home. I just can only imagine, on like a
dude, you're talking to the IR
desktop.
team. We know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I know. So it's good stuff. Anyways, I've digressed a little bit, but yeah.
So hey,
That's cool.
Docker desktop, I'm like looking at it right now. So you kind of is that like it's an application based on your Mac or PC, and you're not utilizing any cloud-based backend, right? You're using your computer's resources. Is that how it works?
Yeah, your computer's resources along with KVM or VMware. Just to contain the systems in it. So it does have some type of protection, but still, people open up that networking.
Oh, it runs like a virtual machine or something?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And that's the other thing. When you're in the cloud, and we could get into like the orchestration a little bit on it. But, when you're spinning up something like a Kubernetes. So I would say.
I love that name, by the way. It's just a fun name to say, Kubernetes.
Oh man, have I talked to you? Have you looked into the history? Kubernetes history is pretty cool, especially if you're like a Trekkie. So Kubernetes is essentially container orchestration, right? So generally it's like, hey, we're using Docker. That's the actual images themselves. And then you have an orchestration layer. And the reason you need an orchestration layer is because, hey, if you do Docker container run, the single line to run everything is like 4 lines long. No, 4 lines. Yeah, 4 lines long in like a console window, right? So you have orchestration that helps like alleviate some of that stuff, and you have it into like a configuration file. And you could generally do it so you'll have Docker, and what sits on top of Docker, what I use is Docker Compose, which is orchestration similar to Kubernetes, and that's where you could set like your your CPU resources, that type of stuff. Well, not with Docker Compose, but with Kubernetes you can, which is a benefit of it. But Kubernetes then opened up its whole administration control plane, talking about the cloud. So we're talking about AWS CLI, the control plane to manage AWS. We're talking Docker daemon CLI, and now we're talking about the Kubernetes, right? And Kubernetes, if you have, a single master node and a whole bunch of Docker images in Kubernetes, essentially there's no segmentation between them, right? From a networking side, you just assume if somebody's on the network that, if a container exists on a defined network, that anybody could sniff it. Because I think behind the thing that is essentially IP tables, it's all done UDP, and but it's been a couple of years since I've dove that deep into it. But the issue was a lot of breaches were happening from breaches of that control plane for Kubernetes, because everybody jumped on it. Your footprint's so wide, it's like, how do we even manage this, right? And so you saw people really slow down, I think, the adoption into it until AWS and Google. So Google has their own Kubernetes managed instances, and so does AWS, EKS, and then I'm sure it's Google Kubernetes GKS, maybe. I have to double check that.
That's interesting. So they use UDP to communicate?
So behind the API itself, because essentially you'll see like everybody exists.
Yeah, but wouldn't you want the handshake? Like, why would you? I don't understand.
So it's been a couple of years since I've looked at the back end on it, and that's exactly what I thought. So once you hit the API, behind the API itself, right, that's controlling all of the containers, essentially think of it as like IP tables. It's like, hey, how do we route this port to this port? It's essentially all that's going on once you hit that API. And from what
but how would you
on the back end,
acknowledge that you got it to that port without the?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's weird.
I have no idea.
You want to hear a UDP joke?
Ooh, yes.
Yeah. I'd tell you, but you wouldn't get it.
Oh.
But I'll be here all week.
I like it.
Well done.
Tip your waitress. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay, so let's kind of circle it back around. What did these guys do wrong? Like, what could they have done, in your opinion, Chris, that could have avoided?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at this, are you guys going to link this threat post article? Like,
sure.
Yeah. So this picture that they have, that they say you could click on it, the Kinsing malware attack tree.
Oh yeah, that goes up like it's an 80. What is that, like 80 pixels by 80 pixels, and then you click on it and it goes to 100 pixels?
Like I have excellent vision. And I can't read this, but like, look, the attacker.
Yeah, we'll link to this.
Yeah, the attacker. Things. Whoever this is, I can't even read their name. So the attacker is directly like at the Docker daemon right there, right? But if this is an enterprise, you should have way more layers of security than just direct access to Docker daemon. So it's like, hey, let's control the networking, right? Let's control ingress and egress, because this also said, one of the things it did was wget, I'm sure, to an untrusted server, right? So that was interesting itself. So there's networking. So, um, that's one layer of it. Two, just hardening of the virtual machines themselves. So I don't know if this is running like within like a managed Kubernetes instance, or if this is, or what it's doing. I don't have the details on that end, but hardening the systems and leveraging a configuration management tool to harden those systems. Because what people initially did is they would have like auto scaled EC2s, right? And I think people still kind of stuck with that. So if you log into AWS console, you just see a whole bunch of EC2s that exist. But all of them are different in their own unique way. So a configuration management tool like Salt goes a long way. I mean, everybody's the environment is so large now, it's almost impossible to manage manually and have everything configured, in a similar way. So a configuration management tool like a Jenkins or a Salt is key to managing those systems. Because a lot of the stuff, I mean, if you look at like the CIS hardening for Docker itself, the very first thing is hardening of the OS. So you really need to harden the OS down first. And then we layer in Docker. Have Docker, has a lot of stuff built in. Don't add everybody to the Docker group. Don't let everybody execute against Docker, right? Try to do everything as code. Start integrating tools like, those continuous integration tools. So if there is an update, it's automatically update the containers and kind of go from there. So the network side of the house, the general operating system hardening. Docker, I forgot what the service, what they call the service, but if you pay for their enterprise service on their website, you could push your own image into your own repositories, and it includes vulnerability scanning. And when we're building out a lot of these people's cloud workloads, I like to be as close to the event as possible, right? And when you're talking about, audit activity on AWS, they call it real time or near real time. So there's a 5 to 15 minute delay between an event actually occurring and you actually getting an alert on that, right? So a lot of damage can be done.
Oh yeah.
Within that amount of, I mean, probably enumeration is going to be done within that amount of time, right? But could potentially be damage.
Well, it depends on how much you've scripted, right?
Yeah. And that's
Cash
the thing.
and I get called into incidents all the time where, it takes 5 minutes for them to do all kinds of things, drop creds, start looking at other machines, pivot to the next machine. I mean, it just depends on how you script it. So yeah, 15 minutes could be game over.
That's a lifetime.
Yeah. Totally. You know what I mean? And it's yeah. So general system hardening, but leveraging those configuration management tools is vital to keep those systems consistent, I would say. When you sent me over this article, since I did my whole house and I have everything at home running as code and our AWS stuff running as code, I was like, oh, just double checking system hardening. And it was literally a single configuration file, and it was like 3 updates that I made to some of like the listeners for the Docker daemon stuff,
Yeah.
So you may think it's like, oh God, we have like 10,000 systems. How are we ever going to do this? But if you're leveraging a configuration management tool, it's a single file, that gets
Updates
deployed
all
to
of
everything
them.
else. Yeah. So
That's cool.
It's beautiful. We had a client that was, a huge Linux shop. And when those glibc vulnerabilities came out, they knew I was going to ask about it. We were going into like day 3 of their PCI assessment, and they ran Salt for their infrastructure. They're like, oh, we've already patched 75% of our environment, and it was like a 5-minute, change control ticket that they had, which was pretty neat to see. So that's what really got me into that stuff.
Oh, that's awesome.
Okay. Definitely. So like aside from the Docker news, I think like, from what I've been reading, they've had some misconfigurations in the past. A lot of people's data's got exposed. Now they're the ones being attacked this time. But, other companies have similar problems, right? Like this email.it. They've been infiltrated for the past like 2 years. And, they've been, the hackers, they called themselves, I think, NN for no name. They sent them a bounty request. They got denied. They said they're bluffing. And now all their data is being sold on the dark web, right? So, you mentioned, check your bill. But if it's something over like 2 years time and they're like slowly pulling data out, you're maybe not going to notice it as much, right? On that end. So in that kind of situation, how would you find out? Like what would be the security measure you could put in place to monitor your cloud infrastructure?
Right. So yeah, I have this conversation with organizations that have the latest AI, machine learning, distributed tracing, whatever they want to call it type stuff. It's like, hey, assume that you're already getting deployed into a compromised environment. What does that look like? right? And the caveat's always been like, well, it needs to be clean or something like that. It just needs to get good data. So it's hard to distinguish. So if you take a look at like what a lot of things do is they just look at the connections that are being made, right? Where's the endpoint going to? And that's why that strict egress control, I think, is vital for an organization. And I thought Sony taught us that, when they had, what was it, all that data exfiltrated over DNS or something like that. I think it was DNS that those articles came out on. It's like, but I don't think it's the people. I think it's just, I think Sony was the first real one where I started thinking, like, oh, you have to really look at the size and the content. And if you look at like some of this open source software that exists, like Security Onion, it gives you that data right away. You could start interrogating, hey, what countries am I connecting to? Do I want to be connecting to those countries? What type of ports am I seeing stuff over? Why is everything not encrypted when it's going out? If things are encrypted, things get a little trickier because most of the time, it's a little trickier to start proxying TLS traffic and stuff like that, but you could still generally look at the endpoint and deduce where they're going to, and then you back that up with the US CERT data. They send out all their stuff in like literally sticks files, so you could integrate it with whatever SIM that you're leveraging. So you have signatures, IP addresses that are malicious, and you can trigger those types of investigations sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think that's like typically some of the recommendations we make, when our incidents, like, for example, let's see, 3-4 years ago, I think when Fin7 was around kind of targeting quick serve and hospitality, we had a client call us that was, they're a national burger chain, and they had been compromised by Fin7, and their data was being sent, or at least they had seen in their firewall logs that a lot of connections were being done to Dubai, and there was large chunks of data being exfiltrated out to Dubai. And at no point did anybody think like, hey, maybe we should block this. Like, and I said to him, I said, do you guys have service? Do you have like restaurants in Dubai? Do you have reason to be connecting to Dubai? No. Okay, can we just block that whole country then? Like, I don't understand why companies don't take that approach more often, especially if you're if you're just U.S. based. And I understand that we're a global economy and all that stuff, but if you're not doing business in China, for example, I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I had my mortgage guy. His website got hacked, right? And it was someone from Eastern Europe that was connecting. And then, I go through it. He asked me to help him out. So I go through his logs and I see all these connections from all these different countries. And I'm like, do you really need to be selling mortgages to Germany? I'm like, no, you're not going to, obviously, right? So block your website from everyone except for the United States. Like, I'm sorry. You just need to be like, we all need to be more proactive and more aggressive in our approaches to defense in order to keep up with the attack trends that are coming around. Now, that's not going to stop an attacker from, coming in through VPN and, saying, oh, they're from New York, but it's definitely going to stop a lot of the ankle biters and a lot of the people that are just out there, scanning the web for vulnerabilities. Right. So I don't know. I just think companies really need to take a harder look at their firewall rules, like you said, and scrutinize, do I really need to do any kind of interaction with these countries around the world? So
totally.
Like South Africa. Yeah. How many businesses are working in South Africa? I have no idea. I don't have clients in South Africa. None of my clients should be talking to South Africa. Right?
Well, we saw all those attacks like the last 2 years, where, you saw people, they were redirecting traffic away from ISPs to get routed to different countries and stuff like that. In some of those countries, they don't have as stringent privacy controls, or they just straight up just ignore them, right? And they just monitor the entire country's traffic. And it's like, hey, you can see the benefit of that. I forgot what it was called, but there was a couple times that happened last year. I think it also happened with Cloudflare, didn't it? It was Cloudflare.
I know a couple years ago, China accidentally, quote unquote, redirected traffic for about 5 minutes. But they accounted for a third of the internet, I think, being routed through them at one point due to a quote unquote BGP issue.
That's right. Yeah, the BGPs, man. Like especially with that, when I look at my traffic and I see it connecting to other countries, I'm just like, oh, like with the Unify stuff, it's like, okay, cool. You could have geo block areas. And I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? I'm like, well, why not do it? I'm like, there's no reason for me to do that. Like if there's content getting served up there, I don't want to get the content from there anyways. And it's like, it's, and you'll notice, so I was talking about this during a webinar about, the current like security engineer operations, that type of stuff. And people really, in the cloud and wherever they're at, they really, I feel, need to get off of this mode of being in a constant firefight to start creating fires. Netflix had chaos engineering, right? Where everything was codified, everything was so uniform that they could start really, creating things and really understanding what their limitations were. But a lot of the times it's the other way around, where it's like, we can't turn this off because we have customers connecting to it. And every single time we've ever dug into those Apache logs where I'm like, okay, cool, let's actually take a look at how many customers are doing it. It's always been like less than a percentage.
Oh
right?
yeah.
Or a half
I
a
mean,
percentage.
I don't know how many clients are like, oh, we can't put endpoint protection on there because that would slow down our app. Well, I'm sorry. If your app is being slowed down by endpoint protection, then you're doing something wrong.
Or TLS encryption. Yeah. And I mean, that was the great thing about the Qualys SSL scans. I mean, because if anytime with PCI, they pushed back the TLS 1.2 deployment for I don't know how many years. And with the Qualys SSL scan, what you can do when you're taking a look at the results, it doesn't just give you an A, B, or C rating, but you go in there, you see what type of devices failed negotiation. And it lets you know, hey, we are supporting these Cypher suites, but we also support like back to Android 8 or whatever they call version 8 of Android, right? Or you're going back to Windows XP. So, you're getting a lot of really rich data, and some of these tools we can use to like validate, some of these controls and really alleviate some of those. It's like, hey, I'm okay if it's a technical or a business restriction, but let's look at the data and see if that's still relevant today, and not just issued 10 years ago because of, things that have changed.
Right. I mean, yeah. And people get, stuck in their old ways of like, well, this is how we've always done it. And it's like, yeah, I get it, but maybe we need to take a new approach sometimes, and I've been saying this for a long time, especially like websites. If I'm running a website and I can see the parameters being passed, and all of a sudden I get a request that's missing some of my parameters, like block that IP.
Yeah.
There's no reason a parameter should just happen to go missing, right? Like someone is messing with the parameters. Someone's doing something they shouldn't be doing. Block the IP and make them sit on the bench for 15 minutes or whatever it is. Make them go get a new IP, but slow them down. And so it's just like that old saying, locks are for honest people. Yeah. Because people are always going to try and find a way, like the deceptive people are always going to try and find a way in, and just make it harder for them to freaking find a way in. Make them go to the next neighbor down the street that doesn't have a locked door, right? Like that's all we want to try and do, especially from the blue team side. So, I don't know.
I mean, one of my first things
rant over. I'll get off my soapbox now. But
I agree with you.
It just drives me crazy sometimes.
I would straight up, like, one of the first things I would do when I would harden a Linux system, was install fail to ban, because it's like, hey man, if you've trying to brute force the same account like 3 times. The first
thing you do is install fail to ban this free open source software that everyone can get
for free.
Wink, wink, clients.
I mean, it's great because like you said, you put him in a timeout. It's like, hey man, this guy failed like SSH authentication 5 times. Maybe he should just go back and rethink how like he's doing password management, right? Or whatever's going on,
Right.
And it just allows you, because not everybody's like an IP tables master, right?
Right.
And judging by the amount of times I've seen, SSH and PAMD hardened appropriately, it's like this just is really that it could be that last resort, right? The thing that stops somebody. That makes you a little bit more annoying, and it makes all those things so much easier to just like implement as well.
Yeah. Again, be aggressive. If I'm an idiot and I type in my password 3 times, I deserve to get locked out for an hour. I don't care. That's on me. That's my fault. Like,
well, one of my favorite ways, I think that Ben, he's our, with how Okta is implemented, is if I like mess up like my 2FA token once, I get an email about it. And I'm like, I love that. I'm like, I love that. I'm like, at first I was like, oh, this is kind of annoying. I'm like, no, actually, I do like that quite a bit. It's just like, hey, just so you know, you messed this up, but it's more like, is somebody else trying,
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. We just got to get more aggressive. Yep. And also not do little mistakes like the Docker thing. So sorry to bring it back, but making it available on the web when it doesn't need to be available on the web. Same with RDP. We've talked about that many times. So I don't know. What was the issue, Cash, with the email IT's web apps? How did they get compromised?
I was trying to look into it, not sure exactly what their break-in point was, but of course, email IT is denying it, and they're saying it was only like some admin servers that were compromised and no client data and whatnot. So, but
It's just
apparently
our
the data is on
admins who
the
have
black
access to the
market.
client data.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no client
So-
data on it, but yeah.
It's just internal data that was taken, nothing
Okay,
nothing
got it.
else. But
I just looked at their page at, saved sessions.
nonetheless, kind of to bring it all back in circle, security is a big thing. Chris, you want to give some plug about why the cloud? How can companies benefit from using the cloud as opposed to keeping their, on-premises systems and whatnot? And of course, how can we help them secure it at the end of the day?
Yeah. Do you have any upcoming webinars or anything, Chris?
I have a lot of webinars coming up and a lot of white papers. So, follow me on LinkedIn,
There you go.
Christopher Callas, and on Twitter at BCallas, BECALLAS. And I'll make sure to put the data on there here shortly. But I mean, so everybody sees the benefit of the cloud, right? You don't just have resources sitting around and you're paying for these systems, right? And you're just paying for resources on demand. So it's definitely significantly cheaper than things used to be. But also use it as an opportunity to grow, like you were talking about, Matt, the old ways. Doing the old ways isn't necessarily bad, because a lot of times they at least have, there's this fundamental understanding of how things work. A lot of these new technologies, they didn't change how things work. They layered in tooling to help people scale and actually be efficient, and be able to manage systems in a uniform way. These tools rose because they needed to meet the demands of like your Googles and stuff like that. And, even though you read about a lot of these breaches that occur, I always like to peel back, the curtain a little bit. And a lot of these breaches are reused credentials or things that were publicly exposed, when there was big orange flags that told them that there's things that are publicly exposed, right? So definitely use it as an opportunity to learn. Don't get scared about it. There's great technologies out there like Control Tower, where you could spin up a dev environment, mess around with something to understand it, then tear it down after. You just don't have these machines lingering. So you have a better playground, you have better production. Definitely look at, I'm seeing a lot of these security, just operations tools definitely come from what software engineers have had to do for the last like 10, 15 years, once their applications just became, dynamic and live. So a lot of these things, like the CI/CD process may be new for DevSecOps, but they've been doing it for a while. So maybe turn to those people and see what they like using, how they like to use it. And I guarantee, it'll probably have some security functionality to it. And yeah, always be learning, I guess. Yeah.
I'll have to, obviously offline, because we're wrapping up, but yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to hit you up on can I just run an AWS web server and not spend $50 a month, because it's blowing my mind.
Well, yeah,
But,
because you got to shut down the server when you're not using it.
Yeah, but it's a web server. Like, I need it up all the time.
A web server. Yeah. I mean, so there's I'm not going to use the
yeah, we'll talk about it after.
phrase, but yeah, there's serverless that exists. So
yeah,
you're just
I have
paying for
no idea,
storage,
man.
but
It's
yeah.
just
We'll save it for another podcast.
Yeah.
How to save money on AWS.
Security minded. Yeah.
Security.
Cost
Legal-minded.
optimization. How to security cost optimize. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
how to run company services at AWS on your own credit card without getting screwed. That'll be the topic.
That sounds like
Anyway,
a plan.
Cash, do you want to take us out, or you want me to do it?
It doesn't matter. Go for it.
All right. Well, thanks again, Chris Callas, for joining us. I love me
Yes.
some Chris Callas, as if you didn't know
Thank you
already
very
from
much.
our exchange here online. So
love
if you have any
maps.
comments, questions, rude remarks, please send them to Chris Callas at Tavora. No, just kidding. Send them to podcast@tavoratox.com, and we'll make sure that those get to Chris Callas, and he can reply to you in his free time when he's not doing white papers, webinars, and on-site visits.
Consulting.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
He's not doing any on-site visits right now. Nobody is. So anyway, thank you. Take care, and Cash.
Yeah, thanks for coming out. And as always, stay tuned for our podcast in the future. And any questions, let us know. Tavora out.